Oh yes, the Spartans that were such military losers. Of course, so I was browsing the internet and I found this article called "Were Spartans Losers?" And of course it's very political, as lots of these anti-Spartan articles are, and it's of course talking about US politics, and it goes in here about being very anti-right-wing. I'm not here to talk about the political side of it, as that's not really what I want to cover on my channel, but much of it is total nonsense. I haven't finished reading all of this, but I just wanted to talk about this. Of course, there is a massive political issue when it comes to studying Sparta, as it has been politically pulled apart, coming even from the Cold War, being depicted as a communist sort of Russia stand-in, with Athens being America. And today, the left-wing media very much likes to destroy Sparta and degrade it by creating its own mirage of the Spartans were losers and pathetic, because lots of American right-wing people really like the Spartans. So now it's being sort of controlled and changed by both political sides, one of which dragging it to be sort of crazy and fanatical, the other one dragging it down to make it out to be nothing because of the other political side's obsession with it. And of course, this is wrong. We should not be corrupting the people of the past because of the people of the present. We should be presenting them in the most realistic, historical way that we can. We shouldn't be twisting to push a modern agenda. And that goes both ways. To start with, the Spartan reputation for military excellence turns out to be, on closer inspection, mostly a mirage. Despite Sparta's reputation for superior fighting, Spartan armies were as likely to lose battles as to win them, especially against peer opponents such as other Greek city-states. So, of course, the Spartan mirage was a sort of thing that happened, and it's been sort of propelled. Sort of stemming from the Spartans created their own mirage to sort of push their military excellence after their sort of failure at Thermopylae. However, their military superiority and reputation originated well before that mirage came to be. So we sort of see Sparta or Laconia's military dominance start to get pushed pretty early on in their development. They sort of conquered Messenia, a massive section, and established themselves as a military power, as they now have one of the largest territories in Greece. They then also have many other conflicts with Argos, which they proved to be victorious in. And quite early on in the Archaic era, Sparta, or Laconia, is recognized as a decently strong military power. They are still renowned as a very strong military power, so much so that during the Persian Wars, they were elected to lead the military coalition against the Persians. It makes no sense to me that you would elect a city-state that has no reputation to support its military prowess to lead a military coalition against a massive, powerful empire. But yes, there are definitely certain parts of Spartan history which are exaggerated. However, there are parts of it that are very militarized, and it was a more militarized state than most other Greek polis at the time, but I'm assuming we'll get into that here. To keep reading, and this bit I sort of find funny, Sparta defeated Athens in the Peloponnesian War, but only by accepting Persian money to do it. So yes, the Spartans accepted aid in one battle, predominantly. It was a naval battle where they accepted aid from the Persians, but they had also beaten the Athenians and their allies plenty of times. So they are saying the Spartans only won because of the money given to them by the Persians, which isn't correct. It helped, but it wasn't the deciding factor of their victories. So this is again, and continue reading here, it says that like Spartan victories at Plataea and Mantinea were matched by consequential defeats at Pylos and Leuctra and these other places. The logic of saying they had great victories but also had great defeats makes literally no sense, because every single military power in the world has had catastrophic defeats. The Romans have had catastrophic defeats. The British have had catastrophic defeats. The modern Americans have had catastrophic defeats. Look at the War of Vietnam. So if we're wanting to judge a military based on the fact that it had catastrophic defeats, then there were no military powers. The Persians had catastrophic defeats. The Mongols had catastrophic defeats. Every single empire, every single military power has had catastrophic defeats. So to suggest that because the Spartans lost at Leuctra and Pylos and Sparta means that they weren't a military power doesn't make any sense, because they also won many battles, and their reputation shows they had a military power, and their military system shows that they were more militarized. Interestingly enough, where the Spartans sort of strong point comes from is the classic phalanx warfare, which is what their army specialized in. So when we look at Pylos and Sphacteria and we look at Leuctra, it was where it wasn't a typical battle. So when you look at these sort of battles that they raise here, the Spartans do tend to struggle when the enemies switch the tactics up on them. Leuctra went very unfortunately for the Spartans, as the cavalry had an issue. We are told by the source that initially they were winning the one-on-one battle. So where the Spartans and the Thebans clashed together, we're actually told that the Spartans were initially winning. However, because the Thebans had piled up a 50-man deep phalanx against the Spartan 12, they were essentially pushed over. And same with Pylos and Sphacteria. The Spartans had actually originally sort of won that battle, and then the rest of the Athenian fleet had managed to come around behind them, and they were ambushed, about 120 Spartiates, ambushed by peltasts, weren't really fighting Athenian hoplites, on a hill. And they were getting pelted at, so they ran forward, the slingers would run away, and then they eventually surrendered because the Athenians literally just said, we'll just keep throwing stuff at them. So again, not a typical sort of style battle. We look at Pylos, one of my sort of favourite moments with Brasidas, actually, where he tried something incredibly bold. Incredibly bold, he wanted to ram his fleet up against the rocks to surprise attack the Athenians. However, it went wrong. To suggest that just because the Spartans had defeats means that they weren't a military power is just sort of nonsense, because so many military powers throughout history have had catastrophic failures, and the battles that they actually show here are battles that are atypical for ancient Greek battles. Of course, the Spartans excelled at the typical style phalanx warfare. That's Xenophon describes how they structured their army, which I will be doing a video on soon, by the way, so keep an eye out for that. And then let's continue here. So that last defeat at Leuctra, delivered by Thebes a mere 33 years after Sparta's triumphs over Athens, which I'd like to say Sparta literally had hegemony over Greece that entire time, and won the Corinthian War, which saw Athens, Corinth, Thebes, and other city-states try and unite against them whilst they were campaigning in Persia. So they also won the Corinthian War after the Peloponnesian War. So in that 30-year period of Spartan dominance in Greece, they were beaten by the Thebans at Leuctra. That broke the back of Spartan power permanently, reducing Sparta to the status of a second-class power from which it never recovered. Yes and no. Epaminondas beat back the Spartans, and they lost a severe amount of men at Leuctra. It was a catastrophic defeat. However, he then launched a failed campaign into Laconia. So he launched a campaign in there, freed many of the Helots who fought with him, but then he ended up failing so much that the Helots actually revolted against the Thebans and rejoined the Spartans. So we have this sort of same point where we say Leuctra was the end of Spartan dominance. It wasn't. It was very much the first domino in the domino collapse that was Sparta, but Sparta still remained quite powerful after that defeat. But yes, the Spartans, after their quite large sort of golden age, their rule over Greece, and their power, didn't really rise up again. Sparta was one of the largest city-states in the classical period, yet it struggled to achieve meaningful political objectives. Also isn't true, many early Athenian politicians and philosophers actually say that they take lots of their inspiration from Sparta. Lots of the higher-ups in many different city-states look at envy at the Spartans for their political structure, so that also isn't quite right. The result of Spartan arms abroad was mostly failure. Sparta was particularly poor at logistics. No, it wasn't. While Athens could maintain armies across the eastern Mediterranean, Sparta repeatedly struggled to keep an army in the field even within Greece. Indeed, Sparta sent the entirety of the initial phase of the Peloponnesian War, the Achaemenian War, failing to solve the basic logistical problem of operating long-term in Attica, less than 150 miles. Okay. If you're trying to say that the Spartans didn't know military logistics, then you are just joking, because that was one of the areas that they excelled, was logistics and structure and organization. That is explicitly how Xenophon says they achieved their military power. You're referring to their failure to solve operating long-term in Attica. They sieged Athens and laid siege to it for ages. They burnt all of its fields, and the Athenians hid inside the walls. They smartly brought everyone inside and managed to rely on their foreign trade routes. They ended up pulling back because their army was there for so long. The Athenians, it didn't really have a lasting effect on, because they were surviving outside and they needed their army elsewhere. That's not a logistics problem. That was a very legitimate and successful attempt to lay siege to Athens, except they ended up basically having a massive standstill due to the Athenian sort of the Athenian Empire at the time having such trade routes through its waterways, which of course the Spartans couldn't really stop. It was in the heartland of Athenian sort of control. The Spartans were at best tactically and strategically uncreative. Tactically, Sparta employed the phalanx, a close order shield and spear formation, but while elements of the hoplite phalanx are often presented in popular culture as uniquely Spartan, they're not. I don't know where that comes from. The formation and its equipment were common among the Greeks from at least the early 5th century, if not earlier. So yes, this is true. But the Spartans were renowned for basically being the best at phalanx-style combat. Xenophon, in his Constitution of the Lacedaemonians, literally describes how their structure was more advanced than the other Greeks, and how they were famous for having a very difficult structure. However, it was quite the opposite. He goes how basically Sparta split its army down into smaller groups, which were basically each file had one commanding officer. They had far more officers spread throughout the army. It was essentially a follow-the-leader type tactic, where they could effortlessly maneuver, and that is where many of their victories come from. They could outmaneuver many of the other Greeks. So the Spartans were nothing special in the sense that they used the phalanx. That's what hoplite combat is. But they perfected it. They obviously suffered some defeats. But at the time, they became famous for using it effectively, and Xenophon literally goes over how they used it effectively. And he says that the other Greeks believed it to be such a complicated sort of structure, and that's why they were the only ones that could do it. But in reality, anyone who could know man from man could do it effortlessly. So I don't understand this point here. Yes, they fought in phalanx just the same as all the other Greeks, but they literally became famous for basically innovating it and perfecting it to an orderly structure. The Spartans were not innovators, slow to experiment with new tactics, combined arms, and naval operations. Now, this is partly true. The Spartans didn't necessarily adapt their classical formations as much as we see the Thebans experiment with at Leuctra. However, it was because it worked for them. So, as I said earlier, the Spartans do tend to struggle when the other armies sort of change up the typical sort of tactics. The same way, I'll use the British as an example here. The British were, in the sort of 1800s, very good at the warfare of the time. However, they struggled in the American Revolutionary War because they weren't fighting typical warfare at the time. They were fighting people who were hiding in bushes and ambushing. This wasn't the style of warfare that the British were used to fighting. But to suggest that the British Empire in the 1800s isn't a military power is just a joke. So we can look at the Spartans here. They had basically perfected the standard formational combat of the time. They did struggle, and they weren't necessarily great to adapt their sort of inbuilt structure to fit the very new and risky formational styles that other armies basically had to adapt in order to beat the Spartans in classical phalanx warfare. So if the Thebans had adapted the same formation as the Spartans did at Leuctra, the Spartans would have likely crushed them. The reason that they won was because they changed it. So that's partly true. The Spartans were quite slow to adapt to new tactics, but it's because their military sort of structure had worked for so long. Instead, Spartan leaders consistently tried to solve their military problems with pitched hoplite battles, because that's what they were the best at. They were the best at. The same way that Athens liked to try and force people to sea, the Spartans liked to force them onto typical combat. Then it tries to twist the Corinthian War as being a failure to Sparta, when they literally won the Corinthian War. So it says they failed to basically convince the Corinthians to rejoin the Peloponnesian League, but they won the war. The Corinth, Athens, Thebes, other polis tried to basically beat Sparta back in the Corinthian War, and they failed to do so. Sparta's military mediocrity seems inexplicable given the city-state's popular reputation as a highly militarized society, but modern scholarship has shown that this, too, is mostly a mirage. The agoge, Sparta's rearing system for citizen boys, frequently represented in popular culture as akin to an intense military boot camp, is in fact included no arms training or military drills that was primarily designed to instill obedience. Yes, okay, so this is true. The agoge, well, it's partly true. The agoge, which wasn't called that at the time, it was likely called the paideia, which is the standard Greek word for education. Agoge is a Hellenistic term, but regardless. We have no mention of military training at all. In fact, we have very little mention of it at all until Xenophon. So archaic and sort of early classical Sparta, we don't know much about the agoge. Xenophon gives us a decently strong explanation as he put his own sons through it. So it was essentially indoctrination into Spartan values, how to think like a Spartan, how to talk like a Spartan, but it was there to build obedience. which of course is a very good military trait. So they were educated, they were told to read and write by their own parents. There was a massive community aspect, but they were forced to live on minimal clothes. They were issued one cloak that they had to wear in summer and winter, and no shoes. They had to, this is where some sources get a little iffy, they had to hunt for their own food, so they were likely starved. However, they were also members of the mess hall. So every evening they would have had very good nutritious meals, more nutritious than most Greeks at the time, but during the day they would basically have to try and hunt for their own rations. But all of this sort of obedience to a military system, to a regimented system, sort of indoctrination into Spartan values, massive sense of brotherhood, and adaptation to the elements were all things that very much helped build obedient, functional soldiers. So it definitely wasn't a military indoctrination as shown in 300, but there were definitely aspects of that structure which would have massively helped the Spartans militarily. We aren't explicitly told that there are no military training at all. We know that there was physical training, we know that there's boxing, wrestling, things like that sort of come into the early teens. However, there must have been a time that the Spartans did practice, just the same as any of the other Greeks, weapon drills, and especially their follow the leader type stuff. So though we aren't explicitly told, they say categorically that there is no arms training. It's highly possible that there was. Likely not a massive section of it, but it's highly possible that there was. Or outside of the agoge. I'm going to call that video here for now. This article is a load of rubbish, but if you'd like to read it, I will leave it in the link below. I sort of just wanted to cover the military aspect of this. It starts to go into politics, and of course, fundamentally, the issue of this article is the whole purpose of the article is to try and ruin a far-right view on the Spartans. It's not to push a realistic view. They're also twisting these sources, again, as I hopefully pointed out. So, yes, the Spartans were not military perfectionists. They were more militarized than other Greeks. They were good at it. They got a reputation well before they built their own mirage. And Xenophon explicitly goes through how their military structure was more advanced and renowned as more advanced by the Greeks at the time. We need to stop twisting historical peoples to attack modern people's political opinions. It is completely ridiculous. It's completely wrong to do. It's just wrong to do. It's immoral to do. These people have nothing to do with modern politics. You should not distort them to push down modern politics. You shouldn't distort them to push up modern politics. You shouldn't use them as a tool to push your own political agenda. And that's precisely what this article does. You can tell from the first 4 paragraphs. It's all anti-right-wing, anti-military, anti-gun. Again, I'm not commenting on any of the political side of it. I'm simply commenting on the fact that, in this case, a left-wing media source is distorting the Spartans to push anti-right opinions in a very unfair way. And just as there is a Spartan mirage which the American right typically likes to uphold, they are creating a Spartan mirage to counter the original Spartan mirage that is also equally as wrong. The Spartans were militarily successful. They were renowned as such. Their structure shows as such. Their whole aspect of their political and philosophical systems being wrong or frowned upon is wrong. We are told that many early Athenians used Sparta as a sort of foundation. They very much liked Lycurgus. They very much liked Cylon of Sparta, one of Sparta's earliest philosophers. This article is propaganda.